Welcome to the DroidDevCast, a podcast brought to you by the team at Esper, bringing you the latest news, thoughtful discussion, and insights into all things Android security, and open source software development. I'm your host, Rin Oliver, Platform Evangelist at Esper, and today I'm joined by Tyler Shields, Chief Marketing Officer at JupiterOne, and Jasmine Henry, Director of Cybersecurity at Esper. We're here this week to discuss all things related to continuous observability. More specifically, what does continuous observability mean? And why should it matter to all types of organizations that are deploying new products and edge devices? Today we're going to look at what continuous observability means to JupiterOne and Esper, and what it means to digital product creators at any organization. So with that said, we're going to get started. Tyler and Jasmine, thank you so much for joining me today.
Glad to be here.
Nice to hear from you.
So for both of you, Tyler, Jasmine, could you share a brief description of who you are, what you do, and the kind of things that you're working on?
Sure, absolutely. I'll take the first crack at that. Hey, everybody, I'm Tyler Shields. I've been in the cybersecurity space for going on about 20 years. I'm currently the CMO at JupiterOne. JupiterOne is a cloud asset management, security, and governance platform. So think, beyond just your general assets, but more like any software-defined asset and applying security to that in a continuous observability kind of way.
And I am Jasmine Henry. I'm a cybersecurity director at Esper. We're a Seattle-based startup that does infrastructure for Android single-purpose devices, which includes everything from mobile point of sale and kiosks to smart exercise equipment and healthcare devices. We position ourselves as an Android DevOps tool. My background's in data, actually. I started off as kind of like a DBA. After undergrad, I was promoted into project management roles where I got to work with the Tennessee Valley Authority on their home energy efficiency e-score program rollout using Android dedicated devices almost a decade ago. And then after finishing grad school, I was an independent industry analyst for about 5 years before I joined Esper. And I've been a customer of JupiterOne in my cybersecurity role for about 2 months. I'm a huge fan of their product, and I'm using it for compliance at our organization.
That sounds fantastic. Wonderful. I actually didn't know some of that about either of you, so it's great to always have the inside scoop. So moving on to my next question, which is the meat and bones of why we're here. What is continuous observability, and why does it matter?
It's actually a very overloaded question. Continuous observability is really something we have to kind of point at and apply to a specific field or section of a field. In JupiterOne eyes of continuous observability, in many ways, it's like shining a light in the dark sections of your attic continuously, moving that spotlight around to every dark corner and continuously checking to make sure there's nothing going wrong in any dark corner of the attic. But the trick there is making sure that that light is continuously running, continuously deployed. In a better analogy, it might even be a big overhead light that illuminates the whole room. Security has traditionally been seen as kind of a point-in-time assessment. And so your application security scans are a point in time. Your assessment of compliance tends to be a point in time. And really, if you're doing security right, continuous security or continuous observability is the first step towards a true continuous approach to security, because if you can't continuously observe your environment, you can't continuously secure your environment. So it's kind of a nebulous answer for a bit of a broad question. But I think as we go through most of this podcast, we can drill down on some more details around that.
I think that's absolutely accurate. I think that Tyler completely nailed it. Esper, like a lot of other kind of cloud-native organizations, we have this kind of vast multi-cloud environment that can change very, very quickly. And so how I use JupiterOne in my role is to see those real-time changes. Kind of adding to that, speaking from the perspective of the smart connected edge devices that Esper works with, continuous observability is about seeing the entire picture, which for a smart connected device at the edge can be configurations, apps, hardware, firmware, and user, and being able to continuously enforce a healthy state for all of those factors. I had an early mentor, Michael Howard of HP, who often said that humans are the biggest piece of malware in your network. And that's definitely true with the single-purpose device space. If you have an employee with a tablet who decides to download an insecure personal app from Play Store or a random website, it may seem okay in their eyes, but it can also seriously threaten the integrity of enterprise devices and data. So in my experience, the security state of an edge device is something that needs to be observed continuously after deployment. Can you track it? Can you remediate it? Can you attribute whether performance issues are caused by a battery being drained because the device is unplugged, or whether it's a serious sign of misuse, theft, or tampering? Some of the most compelling use cases in Esper space include Android respiratory monitoring devices so that patients with chronic respiratory conditions like COPD can breathe. And the big question in that case is whether the product's effectively monitoring their health and safety outcomes. And if there's a device event, can the dev team use APIs to programmatically retrieve crash logs and troubleshoot?
Fantastic. That makes a lot of sense. So, where does that continuous observability fit in with CI/CD and things like DevSecOps?
Yeah, another wonderful question. DevSecOps really is the merging of what used to be three silos, development, security, and operations, into a single unified human being process or approach to development, security, and operations. And I think a broad, well-formed security program will be able to tackle any of those three pillars, development, security, and operations, in a way that requires continuous observability, the ability to understand current state, historical state over time, and future state changes over time to apply security impacts to those. What JupiterOne does when it comes to DevSecOps and CI/CD is really take every entity or asset, as we call them, whether it be, for example, your infrastructure, your cloud infrastructure, whether it's Amazon or Google or Azure, the configuration of that, the configuration of your workloads, instances being run or not run, mapping all of that back to alongside of analysis and connection to your development assets like your repositories and your commits and your code itself, and connecting that directly to your security operations assets of, say, interconnectedness between nodes and design type architecture as code, and really pulling all of those assets in a very generic software defined way into a single view. And so when JupiterOne talks about continuous observability of that full stack, we're talking about taking all those entities or assets, normalizing them, and really, understanding not only the assets, which could result in thousands, tens of thousands, or millions of assets, but the relationships between those assets. And that's where we find the bulk of the value around security for our customers. And it stems from and comes from the fact that dev, security, and ops aren't isolated anymore. The relationships between development, security, and operations, the relationships between those are the relationships that we have to track and understand state of. So JupiterOne really targets all of your cyber infrastructure and security assets and pieces of configuration and content, and actually looks at that continuously for deviation off of accepted secure state. And that's why we're able to provide so many different use cases to our customers, such as Esper.
That is really eloquent. That's remarkably well spoken. The CI/CD can't end when the code's shipped. I think that organizations need to be using production data to make improvements in mid-flight due to that sense of interconnectedness that Tyler referenced. We have a customer whose Android device predicts patient fall risk. And one thing they do is they use our APIs to automatically retrieve kernel logs for debugging if there's a crash or another device event. I think that example is pretty relevant because healthcare device failures have been a very prominent component of the media cycle. There's an unfortunately enormous number of tragic examples where device failures have caused serious patient injury. Healthcare device safety is obviously a very complex topic, but it's a clear example of why being able to make changes in mid-flight really matters, especially if it means avoiding a patient injury or an FDA product recall. So organizations need to be able to learn from real-world data in an environment that's backward compatible with their developer tools. And again, it's that sense that Tyler referenced of the fact that security, development, and ops are no longer separate. So it's a need for transparency and compatible tooling. If a device fails a patient or a user, manufacturers and dev teams need to be able to analyze that real-world data and disseminate a response in real time. So continuous observability means seeing the bigger picture and being able to respond and learn from it quickly.
I agree completely. Having that layer of observability and being able to act on things is crucial, especially when something goes wrong. So, switching gears a bit, I'm going to direct a question towards Tyler and dig into how JupiterOne operates. What's the relationship between continuous observability, DevSecOps, and compliance?
Yeah, I got into that a little bit on the last question. I tend to jump the gun there, but I mentioned before about the breakdown of DevSecOps and the unification of that and the relationships between your assets and entities. What's really interesting is if you take the concept of all of your cyber assets, all of your cyber infrastructure and security assets, from all the ones I talked about already, let's also add in there, identities, human identities, LDAP entries, vulnerability management results, scan results. The breadth of entities is important to success because what we do at JupiterOne is actually unify all of these entities and map the relationships between those entities, but also normalize them. So, for example, what used to be difficult to do for an engineering team when faced with compliance, for example, there's a question in most compliance, do you have any data stores outstanding that are unencrypted and facing the internet publicly? Well, if you're just running Amazon, maybe that's easy, except that you start to think about, wait a minute, there's like 5 different data store classes in Amazon alone. Let's add to that the fact that most companies are multi-cloud. So they might have 2 or 3 different Amazon data stores or a data store in GCP and then one sitting in Azure to support multiple different development languages, right? When you see them start to really understand and grasp the complexity of what we're talking about, what JupiterOne does is normalizes all of that into a way that's consumable and queryable, and you're able to ask those very difficult questions. And so when we talk about the analogy I made about shining the flashlight around your attic, it's to continuously understand what those relationships and assets are, which then directly can drive compliance. Because if we look at all of our assets and we thoroughly understand what the assets are, where they exist, and the relationships between them, we can ask those generic questions and get great answers that are highly accurate and continuously updated. That can then feed a workflow or an alerting system. So when deviation off of accepted compliance norms happens, you're able to secure it quickly. And so the best thing about this is, there's an old saying that compliance is not security. And in general, it hasn't been, because compliance is a snapshot in time where you set a low bar and say, if you can jump over this hurdle, you're compliant. Well, guess what? You're still not secure. And we can prove that because of the vast majority of breaches that have occurred in the last decade. Most of those companies had compliance. And so what JupiterOne is aiming to have is compliance that is secure, right? And you do that by having continuous and complete observability, continuous and complete mapping of the assets and understanding of the relationships, and then continuous and complete alerting workflows and the ability to remediate problems in that model. And so that's what JupiterOne's really focused on when it comes to DevSecOps and compliance is, yes, we do compliance. Yes, we do cloud security posture management. Yes, we do vulnerability management. Yes, we do breach handling, right? But we do that all under the concept of this broad asset security model. And that's really what we bring to the table to help break down the silos of DevSec and Ops.
That makes a lot of sense. Having silos can really impact a business's performance, especially when you can't get visibility into what's happening with your entire system.
That's right. Indeed, that's the key thing. It's the entire system, right? If we wanted to put a point solution in play, we could do a point solution, but the reality is the breadth that makes it valuable.
Exactly. And in that vein, I'd like to hear from Jasmine too. Jasmine, what's the relationship between continuous observability and Kosu?
So Kosu is an acronym that means devices that are not your boss's BlackBerry. Kosu means corporate-owned single use. It's a term from Google that includes Android kiosks, point-of-sale devices, kitchen display systems, your smart exercise bike, healthcare devices, and a lot more. We typically say single-purpose devices. We have data from IDG that indicates that these smart connected devices are going to outnumber humans by a factor of more than 5 to 1 by the year 2025. There's no question that the IoT is growing, and many of us are betting that Android's the platform of choice for IoT growth on the road ahead. For a lot of reasons, Android's user-friendly. It's an open source framework with broad global adoption, and there's really great possibilities for kind of telemetry development with Android. One really compelling example of continuous observability in Kosu is the idea of smartwatches to predict patient seizure risk in people with severe epilepsy. Researchers are actively working to figure out the biometric signals that indicate an oncoming seizure that's detectable by this wearable device before it's apparent to the patient or their caregivers. So in this type of case, continuous observability would be crucial to development testing and deployment to understand these seizure signals and also help these patients and their caregivers respond in a timely way. So continuous observability in the case of Kosu is about getting the insights to the right person at the right time, whether that person's at the edge, a patient at home, or in a hospital, or anywhere else. The relationship between continuous observability and Kosu is about decentralized control and scaling. Organizations need to be efficiently able to manage these fleets of devices as the fleets grow and incorporate custom-built devices, because traditional methods and solutions just don't work when you're dealing with a fleet of 100,000 or 200,000 devices. In that sense, continuous observability is a design factor. When you're custom building solutions, it needs to be part of your infrastructure to create that real-time awareness and response between edge device and cloud.
I love that line of talking, Jasmine, because what you're talking about is going even beyond breaking down the walls of DevSec and Ops and actually breaking down the walls between healthcare patient and practitioner, which is just yet another way of continuously observing and broadening our approach to how we manage that data from a security and operations perspective. So I think it's really cool.
Well, I think that JupiterOne also kind of builds on the idea of continuous observability, which you mentioned at the beginning. It's a huge idea, it's a huge concept, and gives users like me awareness, the ability to respond in real time. And that's really kind of where I think continuous observability as a subset of DevSecOps is going, is into kind of real-time awareness and internet-connected environment and the capacity for real-time response.
Absolutely agree.
I also agree. I think that's exactly right. So I have one more question for Tyler. What are some of the risks associated with treating security and compliance as an afterthought, and why does a concept like security by design and security by default matter?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple different ways you can view this one, right? In the traditional product sense of the word, right? As a company building a product, which is typically where security by design and default has come into play. There's the old notion that it costs a lot more in the long run to bolt on security fixes than it does to design them improperly from the get-go and not have to run into the problems that happen in the long run from having to bolt it on anyways. And that's the big piece of it. Not having security in will inevitably result in failures, risk and other breaches or vulnerabilities. And then as you bolt it on later, the cost of the actual implementation there is doubles, triples, quadruples, whatever that mathematical formula ends up being, but it's significantly more expensive. If we broaden the scope of the question a bit beyond the traditional AppSec view of how we would do security by design and default, I think that it actually goes into how we secure by design and by default our entire security program. I don't think the analogy is any different or the fit is any different if we talk about the broad security program. If we design our daily day-to-day operations of our business in a secure way that matches the level of risk, exposure that's acceptable to the business, to the amount we have to spend to serve the problem and fix the problem, finding that balance and designing that in right from the get-go will result in a higher efficacy rate of the dollar spent. So for every dollar spent, you'll get a return of, 80 cents or 90 cents versus 20 or 30 cents on the dollar spent. And so that's, if we're looking at it in a purely financial mathematical way, one way to look at it. If we look at it in a broader kind of view around the risks associated with treating security and compliance as an afterthought, what you find is that you end up with just so much more resources to go back and retrofit everything than if you had just clicked the box as you were going through the setup, right? Problem is people don't always know to do it. And so with tools out there, JupiterOne being one of them, you can actually point it at your current environment, get that environment compliant, whether it's to a public standard or even an internal standard, right? Security is compliance in our model, and essentially secure your environment as you go in a continuous way. So as you build it, grow, add new workloads, add new segments, add new whatever, those things are automatically collected, managed, observed, continuous observability, compared against acceptable policy, whether it's internal or external, and resulting in a secure environment. You don't have that gap of insecurity that comes with that. So essentially what we're talking about here, using continuous observability to lessen risk in real time, is actually creating a mature security program for your business. They really do equate to one and the same.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
And I can attest that, as a startup, we move quickly. Our cloud environment moves quickly. And the kind of automation that we've been able to achieve with JupiterOne's incredible. I mean, we have cloud alerts being sent in real time to Slack and stuff like that, which is absolutely fantastic that we've kind of set I feel like it's almost like a mature framework for growth without limitation through JupiterOne.
We firmly believe that every company, no matter the size, no matter the resources available, no matter the scope, should have a right to security and risk reduction and safety within the organization, right? And so our product ranges from free product that you can connect to and join and use today up through a product that can support, the broad underpinning of major, large Fortune 100 customers that we already have on the books. So yeah, we're happy and glad and excited that Esper is one of those that is building on top of the JupiterOne platform.
I agree completely. That makes perfect sense, and I'm excited that Esper and JupiterOne are working together as well. To that point, Jasmine, I was wondering, why do edge devices up the ante for continuous observability and DevOps?
So, Your boss's BlackBerry is an example I used earlier, right? This is a mobile device, but it's not really a mission-critical mobile device. If a CEO's BlackBerry or iPhone or Android crashes, it's not a great situation, but the consequences might not be enormous, depending on a lot of security and data exposure factors. In the best case scenario, you're looking at a really ticked off executive who can't respond to their emails and it's inconvenient. But edge devices are another story. We've faced a really scary bout of patient injuries and deaths over the past few years as there's been update issues and pacemakers have started getting hacked. Currently, there's 0 examples on record of actual cybersecurity attacks impacting patient life, including the 2017 WannaCry attack that took down the British healthcare system. But I think all of us in cybersecurity really fear that we're right on the verge of a much different story, especially after a surge of attacks on cities late last year and in recent months. I think for a lot of us, it's a scary question of how long until an attack on monitoring devices or patient implants does result in death. So that said, many single-use edge devices are mission critical. They could be revenue-generating devices like a mobile point of sale at a restaurant or a self-service loyalty program machine at a gas station. But in many more cases, there's a lot more writing on these single-purpose edge devices, such as patient safety, like I mentioned earlier. Organizations are using these smart edge devices to keep lone workers safe on industrial sites or monitor environmental conditions in warehouses or monitor respiratory breathing so that patients with chronic conditions can be kept safe at home with their families instead of paying for hospital stay to access constant monitoring. So single-purpose devices at the edge definitely raise the bar for continuous observability, even if you're not in healthcare. If you're in a consumer-facing industry like retail, restaurants, or hospitality, performance issues at the edge can result in a loss of customer happiness or brand reputation. I read that a study from Shekel Brainway recently stating that 87% of customers expect self-service digital options like kiosks because the COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically changed consumer behavior across many different demographic groups. Edge devices need to be available online, accessible to everybody who wants to use them, and just as helpful and convenient as face-to-face customer service, especially considering that customer service rep interactions are becoming less common in today's world. Not every brand's edge devices are life-sustaining, but they're generally mission-critical. So I think that organizations need to understand what's at risk for them if they can't continuously observe these edge devices for performance and security, especially with the understanding that COVID-19 has changed absolutely everything, and historic data on customer behavior may not be the best indicator of today or tomorrow. I think that companies need to carefully consider the risks of treating security like an afterthought, to Tyler's point, especially with Verizon data that shows that putting security off can double the chances of a multi-million-dollar cybersecurity attack. And organizations need to strive for observability by design and default as they release new products. They should consider as early as possible how they'll observe and respond in a production environment because this is a huge part of their governance frameworks. I come from a development background. I've worked really closely with devs for most of my career, and I can tell you a few things about how developers operate. Most developers, including myself, are really bad at time management, and all of us hate ripping out work that we've done previously. And I mean, aside from developers, who likes redoing work? So if I can kind of lump Android devs and cloud devs and innovators into a single bucket of creators, that's something that we all have in common, is wanting to get it right the first time and not redo our work. To Tyler's point, Ponemon data shows that it's costlier and riskier to redo work when you're not secure from the start, and that's really just confirmed by, I think, common sense and experience. So continuous observability in that vein is a design factor. It's an infrastructure factor, and it's a major factor that feeds into the long-term health and success of edge devices.
That makes perfect sense. I think that's absolutely true. And for my last question, I would love to know what gives you hope about the future of cybersecurity, considering you've both been in this industry for a while. What makes you wake up and go, okay, the cybersecurity industry isn't all that bad after all?
Yeah, I think honestly, the people, it's the people in it that are just amazing to work with. Everybody from both of you fine folks to a lot of the people that I've worked with over my 20-year career in cybersecurity. I do wake up every day and I believe that the bulk of the cybersecurity world has the best interests of the enterprise and the security professional in their hearts. We may not always do the best thing when it comes to helping them, but we have the best interests in our hearts. And I think that's what gives me hope for the future, is that I think someday we will figure out how to design security in, make security ubiquitous, make security just something that comes with everything that we do. And, it may take another 10, 20, or even 50 additional years from now to achieve that goal. But I think it's a rational, reasonable, and, completely achievable goal someday in the future, just because of the people that are involved in cybersecurity today.
Yeah, I think if you'd asked me that question about 2 or 3 years ago, Ren, I probably would have answered that I was given a lot of hope by the fact that CISOs were becoming a part of the C-suite. They were starting to have business conversations. CEOs were starting to take security seriously. And another thing that I feel like was huge a couple of years ago was the fact that I was starting to see women at cybersecurity conferences, which I feel like was not as much of a factor before, gosh, I don't know, 2016, 2017. So those are two things I've seen change in a big way in my career that make me feel very hopeful. But I think right now it's the idea that we're talking about DevSecOps, the fact that we're seeing, development, security, and operations as continuous, as interconnected. And we're starting to talk about security by design and default in a real operational way that's changing the way that we practice and the principles that we use in the workplace. That's something that gives me a lot of hope for how the industry is going to scale security to tomorrow's solutions.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. You sparked a technical nugget in my head too that I want to throw out there. Another thing that really does give me hope is the last 3 to 5 years, not even 5 years, let's just call it the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a real big push to every technology, security tool, product, et cetera, that we use in the enterprise becoming an API-driven technology. And that gives me significant hope. That gives the technical side of me significant hope because the interconnectedness and the relationships can now be properly discovered, weighed, and valued. And so that I think is a fundamental, let's call it a major industry shift that has occurred in the last few years that gives me hope that we might be able to actually bake security into this thing over time.
I think that you absolutely nailed it, and we can kind of pack up and go home now. But you're right. I mean, that's confirmed by Google has that amazing annual State of DevOps report that they do with, I believe it's Dora. And they talk about the most mature DevOps organizations have this just infinitely scalable cloud infrastructure, various measures of infrastructure maturity and cloud maturity, and the idea of infrastructure as code. APIs, like you mentioned, is really what the most mature and effective organizations are doing.
I agree completely. Well, thank you both so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the DroidDevCast. We'll be back next week with another exciting show for you. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode on social media. Continuous observability begins with knowing your assets. The digital age forced an evolution of the term asset. Physical assets still exist, but cloud and digital transformation added complexity that extends beyond the traditional asset model. Download the IT Asset Revolution at JupiterOne.com/DroidDev, DroidDev, to learn how to modernize asset management with the cyber asset. And remember, the first 100 downloads are entered to win a Kata's board. Thank you so much to JupiterOne for this partnership with Esper, and we look forward to your entries. Good luck.